I'm Cierra Bettens. Welcome to APTN News InFocus. This week, we're putting Métis identity in focus. Last week, the Métis National Council released an expert panel report suggesting the existence of 7 Métis communities in Ontario. It drew the ire of 3 Métis governments and the Chiefs of Ontario, who swiftly dismissed the report's claims. In 2021, the MMF left the Métis National Council over concerns about the Métis Nation of Ontario's membership registry. And since then, Métis Nation British Columbia and Métis Nation Saskatchewan also cut ties with the MNC. Now, only the Ontario and Alberta Métis governments remain. But debates about who is and isn't Métis and where the boundaries of the Métis Nation lie have been brewing for decades. To navigate these murky waters, we're joined by Jean Teillet, a retired Métis lawyer, author, and the great-grandniece of Louis Riel. Thanks so much for joining us, Jean.
My pleasure.
To start off, I'm wondering, what are some of your initial thoughts on the MNC expert panel report? What are some things that stand out to you?
The first thing that jumped out at me is that they were given the wrong task. They were given the wrong mandate to do. And that led them down the wrong path. And so then the report is not, can't be helpful because they're asking and answering the wrong question. So let me tell you what the problem is. They're asked to determine if these 7 communities in Ontario are part of the Métis Nation as seen through the national definition of Métis that the Métis National Council passed in 2002. And that's where the problem lies. I've spent 30 years, more actually, in the treaty process in Canada, first in the Yukon, then in the Northwest Territories, and then in British Columbia. And there are 2 big internal issues that a First Nation tribe or a group of nations has to answer in order to figure out their treaty. And the first one is, who are their citizens? Who do they represent? Who's going to be the beneficiaries of the treaty? So that's the citizenship question. Who are we? And all of the places in the Northwest Territories in particular, they had to grapple with overlapping groups and with Métis. So there's a big question of who is the nation that is going to be part of the treaty. So that's one question, citizenship. By the way, it takes years to figure this out. Years of debating, discussing as everybody tries to figure out who the people are. And that's because there are overlapping territories and people are intermarried with other First Nations who belong to other groups, etc. It's a complicated question, just determining the citizenship. A second, equally important and equally complicated question is, what are the boundaries? What's the traditional territory of the people who are in that nation? And that's a whole other completely separate question, because you're trying to determine what the land extent is, not the people themselves, but the land. And what are the boundaries of that? It's a very complicated question because back in history, very few nations had boundaries, right? Or not very articulated ones. There might be some where, okay, there's a mountain range there, and that's a pretty clear boundary. Or there might be that some people know that on this side of the river, this is this people, and on the other side, that's not them anymore. There may be some of those, but by and large, most First Nations, Inuit and Métis, had gray, fuzzy boundaries. And that's just because they didn't have to really determine a hard line boundary. And so they didn't. And also boundaries changed. You can go to war with your neighbor and gain territory, or you can lose territory. All kinds of things can happen to change those territories. But the idea of determining the territory is separate and distinct from determining who the people are. So the problem with this report is that they were told to determine, or they were given a mandate to determine basically the traditional territory of the Métis Nation and whether it includes these 7 communities in Ontario. And this is where the whole thing went off the rails, is because they're doing it through the definition of the individuals, which I just said is two separate questions. So, and then the other thing is it's backwards. You don't come to determine what the boundaries of the Métis Nation are, or any First Nation, by looking at externalities. You do it first by setting up principles about the territory, and then you apply them to the facts that you have, the historical data and the facts that you have about those people. And then you gradually build up what's their land use, where did they go to hunt, where are their traditional ceremonial places, where did their peoples live and move, and all of those, how much did they use the territory? Did they ever go over to all those questions you have to ask about the core group first. Then you should look at the peripheral groups to determine, and really what you're trying to decide in this situation is what's the eastern boundary of the Métis Nation? Does it go into Ontario? If so, how far does it go? And the problem we have here with this report is that they did it through the individual definition, which was never meant to determine the boundaries of the Métis Nation. And I know that because I was on the drafting team of the national definition. So they're using the wrong tool, and they're asked to do the wrong question. And so the answer is not helpful at all, because it's just all wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I'm also wondering, kind of around when and why did these conversations about the possible existence of 7 Métis communities in Ontario begin to arise?
They really started after the Powley case. And that's really because what happened with Powley was the Supreme Court determined that there are Métis peoples in Canada who have Section 35 harvesting rights, and those have to be recognized and respected by governments. And so what happened is the federal government and the provincial governments, who had been willfully blinding themselves to the existence of the Métis Nation for over 100 years, suddenly had to open their eyes up and acknowledge that there were Métis communities with Section 35 harvesting rights, but they didn't know where they were. They didn't know, because they had purposely not informed themselves. So they set about doing a bunch of research and reports to try and figure it out in their own minds. And that's another problem with this report, is that they're relying heavily on those reports that were created by the Department of Justice Federal and by the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources. And I've litigated on all of those reports for ages, and they're deeply flawed. And the idea that the Métis Nation is determining whether these communities are part of the Métis Nation based on government reports that are flawed. First of all, relying on secondary sources is really not considered good academic practice. They should be going back to primary sources and not going through a secondary source. And then the fact that they're produced by the government for its own purposes. And some of them are really flawed in lots of ways. And the Department of Justice ones from the federal government are so flawed. I mean, they called it an iterative process when they created them. And what that really means is that the federal government itself sometimes changed the conclusion on those reports and has its own sticky little fingers involved in manipulating the evidence and the conclusions. So, and yet these are the reports that this report is referring to uncritically. And that's also very problematic. So all of this started after Powley, and then the Ontario government and the MNO decided to do joint research into communities other than the Sault Ste. Marie community to see if there were other communities in Ontario. And that's when they came up with these 7 communities. So then for the Métis National Council's perspective, the question was, okay, if you got these communities, but Métis National Council has basically said, no, Mattawa is not part of our nation. So that was the question that everybody was grappling with, is, are these 7 communities part of the Métis Nation. And you will note, if you look at the presentations on here, that there are no presentations other than from Alberta. And the one from Saskatchewan is very critical of the work in Ontario. And there's nothing from Manitoba in this, who really didn't participate in the process at all. So it's largely MNO feeding the expert panel its own materials and these secondary source materials that are being used to determine. And I think the question's backwards. I don't think you should be looking at those 7 communities. You really, without deciding what are the principled ideas of the Métis Nation. And so, everything about this report I find deeply troubling. I think from the beginning, it's headed in the wrong direction. And I think, and then I can be very critical of the use of some of the materials that I think are wrongly used. And that's because the secondary sources themselves are flawed. So what I mean by that is, I'll give you an example. There's this talk about the Métis flag, and there has been for many, many, many years, it's almost a rumor running around the internet that the flag was given to Cuthbert Grant at Fort William, which is now Thunder Bay today. So that's one of their arguments in this report. Well, if the Métis Nation flag was created in Ontario, on the Great Lakes in Ontario, then surely that's part of the Métis Nation. But I did a deep dive into that whole question of whether the flag was from there. And there is absolutely not one shred of evidence to support that claim. It's just a circular kind of thing floating around the internet where somebody cites it and then somebody cites that other site and they cite it. It's like a snake eating its own tail. And when you dig down underneath any of those reports and claims, there's nothing to support that statement. Absolutely nothing. And yet this report says they acknowledge the paper that I did with Adam McInnes about that. And then they say, but there's better and supporting evidence, but they don't cite it. They cite another report, which is one of the reports that actually has no evidence underneath it. And when you check out the references or the footnotes, they don't support what the statement is. So there's a whole bunch of things like that going on in the report. And, every expert report has mistakes in it. Like everybody's does. Books have mistakes. Historical books have mistakes. You can expect and, understand, okay, that's just wrong. That's fine. But in the totality of the evidence, one mistake or two, that's, I think, a given. You have to expect that some things are not going to be absolutely 100%. As my friend says, perfection is for heaven. So, in the creating of a report, there's bound to be errors. And I accept that. But when they pile up over and over and over, and there's one after another, where they're relying on evidence or they're overlooking evidence or they're only going on the secondary source and they don't seem to check, they don't scratch under the surface at all. They're taking everything at surface value. Then after a while, it just undermines your respect and trust in the report because there's too many things that are not thoroughly researched and put together. So when I put all that together, wrong question, wrong track they headed down, backwards, it's done backwards instead of looking at the Métis Nation and then looking at the communities. They're doing it the other way around. And then the significant errors in the report and the reliance on secondary sources, I find the report itself to be less than convincing. And I really am sorry about that because they knew this was going to be thoroughly scrutinized. Now, I've only had 3 or 4 days to dig in on this, and this is where I'm sure if I go further and go through it more, I'll find more. But people are like the Chiefs of Ontario, Manitoba Métis Federation, Métis Nation of Saskatchewan, they're going to go through this report with a fine-tooth comb. And I think it's my own sense, as much as I respect Larry Chartrand and Marilyn Poitras for the work they do, I don't know the other 2 researchers, I think it's not going to hold up. And that's a real shame because it's a real lost opportunity to try to settle a very contentious matter. And this isn't going to solve anything. It's actually still going to keep everybody hammering at MNO that you don't have any proof. You haven't given us anything to sustain your position that there are 7 historic Métis communities in Ontario here. So I think it's unfortunate, and I wish it had been done differently.
Mm-hmm.
And none of that is to say that I'm saying I wish it had been done differently in order to prove that those communities are really there. I'm neutral on it, right? I just think that we should know and what the facts, and based on historical fact, that's what I want, is the historical fact in there, in order for everybody to come to a reasonable decision. The other thing I wanted to say is that this is a boundary dispute, right? It's where's the end of the Métis Nation discussion? And these are common all over Canada, but particularly in British Columbia, where I was a treaty negotiator for 14 years with the Stalo. That's what the big issue is in BC, is where does one group's traditional territory end and where does another one start? And every time there's a treaty that gets settled, it ends up in lawsuits because the people around them are saying, hey, that's our territory. Even the day COVID hit and we all had to go home, I was in a big meeting with, I think it was like 500 chiefs of British Columbia, and we were all there to talk about this overlap and shared territory, or what you might call a boundary issue, for the First Nations in British Columbia. And it was a very heated, very passionate discussion, and there's no resolution to it. And they've been on about this since the 1990s, trying to find even the basic principles for how you determine what the boundaries are. So the idea that the Métis Nation's boundary on its eastern edge is not settled and is in dispute, this just means it's just another Indigenous nation that doesn't have a boundary, that's debating and arguing and fighting over its boundaries. And it's not unique. If anybody who wants to come out to BC and see the debates and outright fights about boundaries and litigation can get another view on the same problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I know another thing that the MNO particularly has been criticized about is their reliance on root ancestors and individual genealogy as, sort of forming the basis of citizenship and Métis identity. And in this clip, MMF Minister Will Goodon talked about it in an interview with us about the review.
This idea that it's about the individual, and they've got this individual has root ancestors supposedly coming from a community. There's still no connection to the nation, and the connection can be through kinship connections, which if you look at our nation, we're related.
So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on this, and what role does, kinship play in Métis identity, and how does that compare with this idea of genealogy?
Well, I think kinship plays out in all Indigenous peoples' definitions of who they are and who their citizens are. I think that because I think one of the problems we have out there is that the Western world understands identity as a sort of an individual property right that's unassailable. And Indigenous people see identity as a relationship of the individual with the group that you're part of. So if you're Cree, that there's got to be a relationship where they recognize you and you recognize them, and you're part of it. Now, sometimes that's kinship in terms of blood relationship, but sometimes it's a marriage in, and sometimes everybody's got different rules. That's part of the issue here, right? Sometimes it can be by adoption. So there's different ways of coming in and out of, or being part of a community. So, but to my mind, I've got a list of about, 15 things that I think you should look at to determine what a nation is or what its territory is. And I put kinship ties, or what they would call their root ancestors. It's the very last thing on my list. things to look at. And that's because individuals can come in and out of a community in multiple ways. So let me just give you my favorite example. If you look at Britain, the king right now, King Charles, his family are now known as the House of Windsor. So Windsor's their last name now. But before the Second World War, it was Hanover. And it was Hanover because they really were Germans, right? It's a German family that became, so you have basically a Queen Elizabeth, who is of German ancestry, is the Queen of England. And she's married to Prince Philip, who is a Greek prince. And yet they are the rulers of Britain, of England. So I use that as an example because it's just so clear that looking at individual root genealogies can really distort the picture here, right? So that's why I put it at the very bottom of my list of things that are important to look at in terms of determining the existence of the nation and the boundaries and the traditional territory. There's a lot of other things that are way more important. Now, this report does talk about those what I think they call them verified family lines or something like that. But they also are looking at other things. They're looking at political action, at what they call common social and cultural characteristics, and they're also looking at land and water. So I don't think the report wholly relies on those verified family lines. But again, I do think I agree in some ways with Will Goodon that I think the emphasis on that is the smallest thing you should be looking at. The determination of the nation and its where it is and what its boundaries are is not about that. And that again goes back to my initial point about them looking at the wrong question, because ancestry and individual definition of the people and who belongs to it is a separate and distinct question from the territory and the boundaries.
Mm-hmm. And so we also heard from, the chiefs of Ontario who are speaking out against the review. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about how do you think this review, what implications does it have potentially for the rights of First Nations in Ontario?
I don't know what implications it will have. I mean, it's really, like I said, it doesn't, to my mind, solve the issue. It's not a bulletproof. Okay, this isn't like a mathematical equation where you can go 1 + 1 = 2, and here I've got a report that proves that. So what I think is that it doesn't actually it adds to the conversation, but it doesn't solve the conversation. And in any event, the expert panel is really just a recommendation that goes to the political entity. The Métis National Council is what it should go to. And unfortunately for the Métis National Council, we have a defunct Métis National Council right now because there's really only 2 members left. There's the, Ontario and Alberta, and Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and BC are all gone. So there's no real Métis National Council left that's functional at the moment. Doesn't mean it might not get reconstituted, but it isn't functional at the moment. And it's not in a position to make a decision. And the expert panel is only advice. And as somebody who was a lawyer, I'm retired now, but who was a lawyer for a long, long, long time, I know you can give your clients advice until you're blue in the face. They do not have to take it. So, and often they don't. So I think that what we're going to see here is that this is just going to be another point where people will take sides on it and stand on one side or the other and say, see, this doesn't prove anything, and here are all the flaws in it. And the MNO will stand and say, look, this is a wonderful piece of work, and look, it tells you, and their recommendation is that these 7 communities are part of the Métis Nation, and that solves the problem. And everybody else, that's the answer to the question. And so that, it'll be interesting to see whether they, as the only 2 members left of the MNC, actually then try to push this through and say that that they are part of it. But I don't think anybody else thinks the MNC is very legitimate at the moment, just because it's non-functional without the majority of its members. So I think the chiefs of Ontario will probably use this. They have very good people and they will pick this apart with a fine-tooth comb. I'm sure we're in early days because it only got released a few days ago. So there are people and academics who are just going to go through this very, very, very carefully. And unfortunately, my first take on it, and this is really just an initial take, is that I don't think it's going to hold up and help solve the problem. I think it's just going to contribute to the chatter on both sides. The for and against sides are just going to each say, the chiefs and the MMF will say, no, 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 this is no good. And MNO will say, this is a great report and it's perfect and you're unreasonable for not accepting its results. And that's unfortunate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, before I let you go, I kind of want to go back to, your first point about the approach being wrong. I'm wondering, how do you think this should have been approached and, where to next from here?
Well, I think the thing that needs to happen, and I hesitate to go here because I've been part of these discussions in British Columbia with First Nations for a long time, and it's really difficult to resolve boundary issues. And a lot of that is because Indigenous peoples are intermarried. The core area of any territory. So if you're talking about the Stalo, the core area up the Fraser River, if you're talking about Ka'aman, the core area around Powell River, the core areas are fine. It's the outer edges where you bump up against another group that are the difficult ones to determine. And that's where we are right now, is that if you go into Ontario far enough, you're bumping into the Great Lakes Ojibwa people, and you're bumping into the Algonquins, and that their territories and their people. And so because the Métis are deeply intermarried, usually with their First Nation cousins, so we see this on the prairies all over the place, because the bulk of Métis Nation people are Cree extraction. It's difficult to thread that needle. And I found when we were trying to figure out how you determine boundary issues in British Columbia, it's very, very difficult on the edges, because when you get to the edges, that's where the most intermarriage is happening. And that's where you get, for example, a band where half the band is married into one group and half of them is married into the other group, and the other half, if you can have three halves, are all intermarried. And so trying to determine which group that band belongs to, are they Nakatman people or are they Stalo people, because they're right on the border, is really difficult to determine. And where do you exactly place that border? And then there's other questions like when, at what time are we going to put the magic, I used to call it your Kodak moment, but now that we all have phones and our cameras in our phone, no one knows what Kodak is anymore.
Yeah.
But what's the magic time period that you're going to determine this on?
Mm-hmm.
Are you going to look at 18 something or other? Are you going to look at 17 something or other? Like, are you going to look at 19 something or other? You're going to look at today? Like, what are we? So all of those things should have been determined ahead of time. And none of that is determined in this report. They don't look to those kinds of issues. And that's part of the other problem with the report, as I see it, that if they'd been, I think if the mandate had been more clearly established, then I think the panel would have probably headed down a different road and might have come up with a better answer. But my big caveat on this is that BC's not solving this problem either. They're arguing over it in the same way that we're seeing the Chiefs of Ontario and the Métis Nation of Ontario arguing over these things. And in BC, everybody's arguing over this stuff too, only it's First Nation versus First Nation. There's no Métis in the middle of the mix, but they're arguing over it too. And it's because it's really hard to determine in 2020, the 2020s or the 21st century, where historical boundaries are And again, I go back to the question, when are you going to pick the magic date? And B, do they shift at all? And all of the other political things, diseases that wiped people out, made borders more fluid, made people marry together, all of that historical information, which is deep and rich, makes it very difficult in the 21st century to say, okay, here is where the border is, and make it definitive. And this report muddies a little bit of that too, because they are looking at modern governance practices also in order to answer the question. And to my mind, that's a different question. So if you're going to determine what the historical boundaries are and whether these 7 historic communities are part of the Métis Nation, you've got to figure out when you're talking about. And then you could also attack this from a modern perspective and say, okay, well, let's acknowledge that there are 7 communities there, and maybe they weren't part of the historic Métis Nation, but maybe we could be in a federation together now for the purposes of this century, and we could work together. But that's a political decision. That's not a decision that an academic should be making. That's a very, very political debate and discussion that the leaders would have to get engaged in and should be taken to the people as well. So this is the kind of discussion and debate that's going on in BC in the midst of the treaty process. And it's exactly what we're seeing here. And tackling it the way this was tackled, I just don't think that this has any prayer of solving the problem for the politicians to grapple with, and hopefully to stave off the litigation that is coming down the pipes from the chiefs in Ontario. And I don't think this is going to stop that at all. This is just going to add fuel to the fire.
All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Jean, and helping us, read through this quite complex issue. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Sierra.
This episode of In Focus was produced by Mark Blackburn and Charmaine Straker, with editing by Jesse Andrushko and hosted by me, Cierra Bettens. If you're enjoying the show, let us know by leaving a rating and review. You can find more APTN podcasts, like APTN News Brief and Truth in Politics, by visiting aptnnews.ca/podcasts or on your favorite player. Thanks for listening.
Hi, I'm Dennis Ward, one of the hosts of APTN National News. We've expanded our Truth in Politics panel into a weekly podcast. Each episode, panelists Jennifer Leywitz and Negon Sinclair join us to examine key issues affecting Indigenous peoples across Canada. Listen and subscribe on your favorite podcast player.